So good afternoon to everybody. We're going to start on, continue on the chapter about theories of demography. And you saw that I did not include a link, a password for the Zoom link. I will do it, so you should just use the new link, which includes the password for the next class on Thursday. For some reason, when I use the presentation mode here on PowerPoint, the chat disappears. So if you want to make some comment, I will not see your comment if you write on the chat. So just please unmute yourself and ask your question, okay? It's just whenever I press the presentation here, it disappears. So I will continue here. And we were talking about early writings about population. Kind of mentioned that still today, the studies of demography, how we understand population changes over time, it's being influenced by these pioneers that wrote about population. So we're starting to talk, we talked about Durkheim, and then we will start talking now about Thomas Malthus. So he is the most well-known early scholar who wrote about population growth. So this book here, an essay on the principle of population as it affects the future improvement of society, with remarks on the speculation of Mr. Godwin, Mr. Condorcet, and other writers, written in 1798, is considered one of the first book studies that really try to understand what are the causes and consequences of population growth. So his main argument is that resources in societies, such as food and shelter, they usually grow at an arithmetic rate, which is slower than the rate in which populations grow. So populations grows in a much faster rate, in a geometric rate, and this rate is much faster than our capacity as a society to produce food and shelter to sustain the population. That's his main argument. So his main consideration, or his main recommendation for societies is that if we do not do anything to regulate population growth, if population growth is left unchecked, then it's going to grow at a really fast exponential pace, while our capacity to produce food and shelter as resources to society will grow as well, but in a much slower pace, in an arithmetic pace. And the terms geometric and exponentially here, I mean, they are based on this mathematical concept that it's much faster than in an arithmetic pace, but geometric and exponentially here are taken as synonyms, as a fast pace, while our capacity to produce it grows over time as we develop as a society, but it doesn't grow as fast. So he says, okay, if population grows a lot and we left it to grow without any implementation of any policy to regulate population growth, then we are not going to have enough food. We are not going to have enough resources to sustain the population. So he mentions that there are some ways to prevent the population to grow so fast. And he divides these different ways as, he classifies them as preventive checks or positive checks. Preventive checks is pretty much the idea of the moral restraint or postponement of marriage. So people not engage in sexual activities, postponing marriage, getting married only when they have enough resources to provide to their future children. In positive checks, he mentions society also exactly because you start facing issues of not having enough food and shelter, societies engage in war with other populations to try to get resources from these other populations, or some societies that don't have enough food for all its members can start to experience famine, pestilence, misery, poverty, and all other forms of issues. The terms here that he uses, preventive checks and positive checks, is just a way to classify these different ways in which we can regulate population growth. He's not saying that he likes wars, he likes famine, he likes poverty. I think we can criticize Malthus in a series of different ways, as we're going to show you here in the next slides, as it's done in the textbook. But criticizing him because he used this term, positive checks, for war, famine, pestilence, you miss the chance of constructing a better counter-argument against his theory, right? You just miss the point. I mean, he's just saying that you have two different ways, two different styles of preventing population growth. And he used these terms, which might not seem interesting, to call famine, pestilence as positive checks. But that's what he did back in the late 1700s. What is important for him, all his work on trying to understand the relationship between population growth and well-being, it influenced the work of several other scientists, Charles Darwin, Herbert Spencer, David Ricardo in economics, John Keynes in economics as well. So it's important to know that there are a lot of criticisms against his theory that might be simplistic in some cases, but it kind of like his work puts demography in a center place and gives more attention into population growth. And after that, we start to look at other workers that look not only at population growth per se, but also population composition, distribution, as we have been talking since the beginning of this course, right? And so Malthus agreed that people have a natural urge to reproduce, so they have many more children than the ability of the society to provide food to that population. And the increase in food supply, increases in an arithmetic pace, cannot keep up with the population growth that increases in a geometric pace, which is much faster. The major consequence of population growth is poverty. And this is central. Earlier in the course, I mentioned to you what it means independent and dependent variables. And understanding those concepts is important now to understand these different theories that try to explain demographic trends. In his case, in his theory, Malthus is saying that population growth explains poverty. If we have population growth in a really, really fast pace, we won't have enough food supply for the population, and that will cause poverty. So population growth is the independent variable that causes poverty, right? So poverty is the consequence of population growth. Population growth is the cause of poverty. Poverty is a stimulus for action that can lift people out of misery. And he sees as like poverty, we reach in a stage in society that we cannot provide food to everybody. We have this situation in which people don't have the basics to live. So we should implement some actions. So the government should implement actions to take people out of misery. Exactly because population growth was so much faster than our capacity to produce food that we reached that situation. So showing his theory in a graph, that would be the idea. You have time going by in the horizontal axis here, and our capacity to produce food grows, but it grows in a arithmetic pace. So this case here, he's exemplifying. This is theoretical. He's not using data. This graph here is not using data from a specific society in a specific year. This graph is more, this is from the book, like from John Wick's book, and it's more like just putting his theory in a graphical format. So this is the capacity of humans in a specific society to produce, to have food being produced in acres that are under cultivation. So it grows because technology increases our knowledge about how to produce food. In a certain point, the population size is lower than our capacity to provide food to that population, but population starts to grow in a faster place, in an exponential geometric place. So we will reach a certain time period in which we, instead of having food surplus, we're going to have food deficit. So in this case, population size, population growth will cause poverty in that society because we don't have enough food for the population. Patrick?
Does Malthus, did he ever take into account the ability to also exponentially increase food production growth as well? Because if all he says is that food is just a straight arithmetic line, when there are ways that we can exponentially increase food production, does Malthus ever take that into account?
That's one of the criticisms about him. So Patrick was asking exactly that here, that maybe our society will develop in terms of technology kind of fast, so we will be able to increase food production, not only in an arithmetic pace, but in a faster geometric pace. So he did not consider that technological advances could increase food production to deal with that population growth. What is interesting that he wrote that book like in the late 1700s, 1798, and but exactly around the time that he wrote that book, some of these advances in food production were going on in the world, and most specifically in Western Europe during the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution is a moment in human history that we start to be able to produce in a much faster pace food supply to the population than we thought before. And afterwards, with the Green Revolution in the 60s, with more advancements in technology, we reach even faster production. So the answer to your question is no, he did not think that we would be able to do that. He described humans as no different than all living organisms in the ability to increase at a geometric rate. In his view, we were all competing for space and resources. And so he was pretty much saying that poverty was an inevitable result of population growth. Population growth causes poverty. And Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they kind of like their theory went in the other way around. They said, hey, poverty, lack of access to better living conditions and even contraceptives, or even and because those families experience so high mortality, they will tend to continue to have a lot of children. And poverty, how the society is organized economically by concentrating the resources on the hands of fewer people, and a lot of people don't have enough resources, that causes poverty. So the way that the society is organized, the way that the capitalist society is organized, causes poverty. And usually people, like poor people, they tend to have more children, and that causes population growth. So they kind of invert the analysis. They kind of said that actually poverty, it's a consequence of how our society is organized economically, and that poverty causes population growth. So population growth in this case, in the Marx and Engels point of view, it's seen as the dependent variable and poverty as the independent variable, right? So we are here starting to criticize Malthus. His belief that moral restraint was the only acceptable prevent check was also criticized, because his main point is like the preventive check, one of the ways to do preventive check is to avoid intercourse until marriage. So pretty much abstinence to avoid having children before you form a family. And you would get married only when you can afford the subsequent children. So his preventive checks did not really work in how our societies are organized, because people do not practice abstinence like 100% until marriage, and people do get married, even in some cases, when they are not in a really well economic situation to have children. And some argue that he ignored the impact of contraception, so that's related to the previous point. So Malthus was a clergyman, so he was a religious person, and religion was an important thing in his life. And he didn't see contraception practice as being moral, right? So he didn't see contraception as an acceptable way of people to control the size of the population. He saw abstinence before marriage and getting married only when you can afford to have children as correct ways to prevent population growth, but not the use of contraception to avoid fertility. That was not accepted under his religious beliefs. Another criticism, he never clearly defined subsistence as either food or means of subsistence. So subsistence, what exactly is subsistence? Is just the ability of people to buy food and have a house, or is it related to other means of subsistence? For example, getting access of good education that will lead to a good job in the future, overall life standards, even like infrastructure, public infrastructure, such as a water system organized by the city or sewer system. What exactly was subsistence was not really clearly defined in his work. So exactly because he did ignore these facts, and by the fact that he was a religious person, he did not really think that contraception should be seen as a way to control population. His principles or his theory was not strong enough to explain the European and North American populations. Exactly because in those places, with the Industrial Revolution, these countries the increase in subsistence have far exceeded the human tendency to reproduce. Now, we have much more control over technology, and we can produce much more food and provide shelter to population and other means of subsistence than he predicted, right? And that's really clear exactly in Western Europe and North America. But even with all these criticisms, his theory is still being used and influencing a lot of researchers. And these researchers that use Malthus as his as the background for their analysis are usually referred as new Malthusians. So the new Malthusians agree that resources are limited, but argue that people should use birth control. So here they are not limited by religious beliefs. So Paul Enrich, he wrote, like the main book that he wrote, Population Bomb, mentions that we should control population. And he comes more from a biological background. He says that human beings are acting the same way as other animals without any control of the size of the population. Garrett Hardin, Strategy of Commons. Just to show you something here. Paul Enrich, if you go to our course website, And so our course website here, there is a video that was produced by the New York Times, The Population Bomb. It's a shorter video than the previous ones. It's only 13 minutes long. And it's really good. They interview Paul Enrich. They interview exactly this scientist here. And even today, even though his theory did not confirm, he says, oh, we still might have problems with population growth. And then his critics would say, oh, his theory did not predict how we developed in these previous decades, but he's still saying that it's a good theory. So it's a contentious debate, but it's an interesting debate. And it's good for you guys to watch this video, really short video, and it goes more. And it shows these people argumenting and counter-argumenting each other. And it's talking about exactly this topic here, right? They mention exactly his book. And that's the title of the video, the title of the video, The Population Bomb, is based on the title of his book. So Malthus has all these criticisms, but at the same time, people nowadays say that even in developing societies that still experience high levels of fertility, governments should implement some policies to provide family planning programs to those families. And so they are kind of like using a new approach that Malthus suggested, but now suggesting the use of birth control. At the same time, they're not negating the fact that poverty actually is the cause of people having a lot of children. So population growth might cause poverty, but poverty causes population growth. So you can try to deal with this issue in different ways. Providing birth control, family planning programs, using this new Malthusian approach, but also thinking as Karl Marx suggested. So he was an economist and philosopher who disagreed with Malthus about this theory. Here, like I did with Emile Durkheim, I'm focused on Marx's contribution about exactly this debate in relation to population size and poverty and so on. So his main theory is that society is divided on these two main social classes of people. The capitalists, the bourgeoisie on one side, and the workers, the proletariat on the other side. The capitalists, they own the means of production, and they exploit the work of the proletariat. And capitalists start over time to accumulate a lot of wealth, and that creates a lot of inequality in the societies. And did I tell you about like a Netflix series about exactly inequality? I think it was another class. Robert Reich was the former labor secretary under Clinton. And he has a couple of documentaries that he organized, and he's a professor nowadays in UC Berkeley. And he has this these documentaries. One is Inequality for All from 2013, and another one, Saving Capitalism and Democracy from 2017. And he's pretty much the first one focusing on the increase in inequality in the country, how exactly the capitalists, the ones that own the means of production, they start to concentrate more wealth. And Saving Capitalism and Democracy, saying this huge concentration of wealth might undermine our political system, the democracy, because those people with a lot of economic power, they use that economic power to organize our society politically. All the rules of government those people that are against a big government, actually the ones that have more economic power, create still rules for their own benefits. And it's interesting that some of his critics call him a socialist and so on, a communist, but his point is like he is not. He is pro-capitalism. He is just trying to think of a society that doesn't create so huge levels of inequality and poverty. So all this, I mean, of course, here you have to have the subscription to Netflix to watch it, but all these resources are out there. It's really, really interesting, these two documentaries, Inequality for All from 2013 and Saving Capitalism and Democracy from 2017. And it's good because like in these documentaries, they show his classrooms, kind of an auditorium much bigger than this one here, with like a bunch of people sitting on the floor to watch his lectures. So it's just interesting to see that as well, how famous he is and people wanting to learn from him. And this is related to the Marxist approach. I mean, he doesn't call himself a Marxist or socialist or anything, but it's related to this fact that you have a society in which specific groups, they concentrate wealth on their hands, and that creates huge levels of inequality. So just remember, under the Malthus theory, population was the independent variable that causes poverty. So poverty is the dependent variable. Poverty is the consequence. In the Marx point of view, population was the dependent variable. Population is the consequence of how our society is organized economically. The way that we are organized economically, capitalism, is the main cause of poverty and inequality, not population growth. Regardless of fertility level, if we have low fertility levels, like here in the US, we have fertility levels like around 2.1, 2.3 children per woman. Even in societies that have low levels of fertility, you still have inequality, you still have poverty, exactly because you have the bourgeoisie benefiting the most from that economy. So, but he mentions, okay, the way that we organize economically through capitalism causes poverty, and poverty causes population growth. But he also agrees that population growth, when there is no check from the society, no control at all, no concern about population growth can be a problem. But then, he mentions the potential difficulty of population growth can be regulated in a communist society. And of course, the critics of Marx mentioned that he did not really explain how the communist society would be organized. But would be what I think from this, both from Malthus and Marx, is to learn from them how they were so good so many years and centuries ago to understand our society, and it helps us understand our society even today. Okay, he didn't really think how the society should be organized after capitalism is really well defined, but he did provide really good explanation of how our society is organized right now, right? The capitalist society. So in the Marxian perspective, I mean, other people that came after Marx and started using him as the main theoretical resources, each society at each point in history has its own law of population that determines population growth. For capitalism, the consequences are overpopulation and poverty. For socialism, population growth is readily absorbed by the economy with no side effects. But again, how exactly that would happen, that was not really clear, well defined in his work. So the major criticism of Marx is that he provided no guidance to how to get to a socialist mode. I mean, but we have to, at the same time, you have to see that like he provided a clear way, a good way to understand how our society is organized nowadays. I just like to open a little parenthesis whenever we talk about this word socialist. Here in the US now, I mean, you have a specific group of politicians like AOC and Bernie Sanders and so on that they call themselves socialist Democrats. But the word socialist, socialism, communist, and communism, they are not so seen as negative as they were some years ago here in the US, but there is still a negative way whenever we hear socialism and communism here in the US. I'm talking not about me, I'm talking about the society as a whole. But the interesting thing is that if you think about the policies that these politicians are proposing here in the US, it's to deal with the issues of poverty and inequality. And they are not proposing a socialist society as the Soviet Union was, or as Cuba is, or North Korea is, in which all the industries and means of production are owned by the government. It's different. What they're saying is like we should have that wealth created by these companies. It's still private companies, being regulated in some way that you don't have such a huge concentration of wealth in the country, which is what Robert Reich is talking about in those documentaries that I mentioned. And that's a criticism. It's more like something that I always notice in the American society. Americans like to create some names for things that already have names. So Bernie Sanders and AOC, they're not socialist Democrats, they are social Democrats. What they are proposing is not what Soviet Union or Cuba had, it's what Scandinavia, France, Germany have, which is a government that provides more social service to the population and tries to decrease inequality. And it's funny that I also mentioned, like it's kind of like one of the most popular sport in the US. You create a sport that's based on rugby, you change the rules, do all these different changes, and instead of calling it, I don't know, American rugby, you call it football? Football is something else. There is another sport for that. So I always like to mention that the way that we mention, we Americans like to create these names, confuse everything. Even the word liberal. Liberal in any other part of the world is talking about being pro-free market. It's related to neoliberalism, of no rules of the government. And here the word liberal is to qualify people on the left, and then you create another word, which is libertarian, which in other parts of the world, it's used liberal. So it's just everything gets really confused whenever you use the concepts that are used right now in the US. What's that? I know. It's just like, it's interesting. But for me, it's interesting how people that want to bring a movement, a political movement, instead of using their self-classifying as social democrats, they self-classify as socialist Democrats. It's just counterproductive, you know? And here when I'm talking, you guys understand what's my point of view, right? I mean, but I'm not saying that you should think the way that I think. We just have to be more strategic if we want to bring more people together. Cool. And now, after looking at these early writers that dealt with population issues, we apply it into specifically about demographic changes over time. I was talking to Patrick before the class started, and he was, yeah, when I read this chapter, it mentions demographic transition theory, which we mentioned already in the chapter about world population trends over time. It's exactly that, because the world population trends over time is chapter 12, and this one is chapter 2. And on chapter 12, they do mention the demographic transition theory, so that's why I gave a short introduction before. But here we go a little bit more in detail about what the demographic transition is and when it started. So the demographic transition theory is the most prominent explanation for population growth. Sometimes it can be referred as the classic demographic transition or first demographic transition. And it was developed by Thompson, Notestein, and extended by Davis. Right? So it's a more recent way that you compile all these different theories about demography, changes over time. You look at historical data for different populations and you try to see some patterns, some trends that were similar in those societies. And what they understand is that whenever you're talking about population growth, you have to break it down by the components of demography. In this case here, fertility and mortality. So changes in the size of the world's population over a certain period of time are due to changes in fertility and mortality. So 4 stages of mortality and fertility change, there are 4 stages of mortality and mortality and fertility change in the process of societal modernization. So the trends in fertility and mortality, they change over time, as we saw before in those diagrams and those graphs, passing from high levels of birth and death rates, and exactly because we have a lot of people dying, but also a lot of people being born, the population doesn't change as much in size. And then you start seeing industrialization and modernization that influences a decline in mortality, influences mostly a decline in mortality for young children, for infants, babies under the age of 1. And then you start seeing lower death rates, but still people having the same high levels of fertility, and that creates an intense population growth. But then afterwards, as people realize that they don't have to have as many children for them to survive to older ages, and with industrialization, modernization starts to be more expensive to have a lot of children, fertility declines, and then you start to have lower birth and death rates. And you see a decrease in population growth. What the work of Malthus was more concerned was at this point here. Because right after industrialization, modernization, what you start to see is that people don't die as fast anymore. Mortality rates decline, but people keep having a lot of children. That creates this intense population growth. What he was not able to see on his analysis is break it down, mortality and fertility, to see that afterwards fertility would also decline. And then in more recent years, more developed societies, they reach really low levels of fertility and mortality. You might see some slightly fluctuations up and down of fertility due to postponement in fertility. Women, they start to have children at older ages, they postpone, so the fertility goes down. But as they restart having children, the fertility might go up a little bit. And because the levels of mortality are so low, what's fluctuating more is fertility because of this postponement. Any natural increase or decrease is usually due to fertility, right? And this is the same graph as we saw before. The stage 1, high levels of mortality and fertility, they call the pre-transition, pre-industrialization stage. And then you get into the transitional industrialization, modernization stage in which mortality declines a lot and you have a lot of population growth. Fertility starts to decline in stage 3. And then here you see some negative growth, positive growth. This stage called the incipient decline stage that's being experienced by more developed countries in our society. This is the graph that I usually use for notations whenever we are testing the knowledge from this course here in quizzes and exams. But I also, as we saw before, I included this other graph here, that they pretty much break down the previous stage 3 here in stages 3 and 4. Just because I think it's interesting to see this pattern here of population increasing a lot exactly in the moment that mortality declines and fertility is too high. And then afterwards becoming more stable and population might decline afterwards. And it summarizes here the levels of birth, death rates, and natural increase on these 5 stages. And here's pretty much like putting the world population into those stages. You're seeing which countries are in each one of these stages right now. So the transition began in the 1700s and later in Europe. And it's not complete in most of the less developed countries. So many African and Middle Eastern countries are still in stage 3. So they still have high levels of fertility. So they still have high population growth. And that's exactly related to what we saw in Nigeria, India, that they expect to have huge population growth in these next years. And as we saw in those projections until 2050 and 2100 in African countries, exactly because their fertility is too high. Some in Latin America are moving towards stage 4, also the US. And these variations change population distribution. This is related to those tables that I made based on the Hans-Rosling video, showing that proportionally we're going to have a much higher percentage of the population in Africa in these coming decades, based on projections to 2050 and 2100, exactly because they have higher levels of fertility, population growth is still high, so that changes population distribution in the world. Beginning of the 20th century, we start to see the majority of the population reside in more developed countries, because now people even in the beginning of the 20th century, the majority of the population was living in more developed countries. But as developing countries, they start to improve mortality, so mortality declines, and that creates a high population growth in less developed countries. Then you start to see a reverse of population distribution, right? So, for example, in 2014, of the world population, 83% already lived in less developed countries. And only under 17% lived in more developed countries, exactly because more developed countries, they are more advanced stages of the demographic transition. And the share of less developed countries population will increase in these next decades. And that's, again, really related to those tables that we saw before on chapter 12 about world population change over time, based on the videos by Hans-Rosling. So you first have this first demographic transition that we talked in previous chapters. You have mortality decline, and then fertility follows that decline. And then some other demographers more recently, they suggested a further transition, the second demographic transition. So Dirk van de Ka and Lestage, they suggested that further fertility declines are due to other demographic behaviors. And these other demographic behaviors, a lot of them is exactly what we are experiencing right now in the US, what we saw in chapter 13. We see increase in age at first marriage, so people delay to get married. Increasing chances of cohabiting, increasing proportions in divorce, and increase in age at first marriage also is related to postponement in fertility. So women start to have children at older ages. You start to see the emergence of same-sex partnerships and marriages, increasing rates of non-marital childbearing, And voluntary childlessness is more acceptable in society to don't have children at all, right? So all these factors, all these demographic behaviors, they are all associated with further declines in fertility levels. So you start to see more developed areas, exactly moments in which fertility is below the replacement level, and you start to see population decline. And in even more recent years, you have demographers emphasizing a further transition, the third demographic transition. So Coleman expanded the demographic transition theory. Increasing tendency of low fertility countries rely on immigration will be a policy to maintain the size of their population. So they start to say, hey, exactly related to the second demographic transition, all these demographic behaviors making these more developed countries have low levels of fertility and population decline. These countries will experience a population getting older, so you have population aging, and they will need more people to work in their labor market. So one way to deal with it is to promote immigration. So this changes composition of national populations, culture, physical appearance, social experience, self-perceived identity, and so on. And then you have the backlash against it, which we have been seeing exactly in the US and Western Europe. Right here in the US, it's really clear since the previous presidential election, all the discourse against immigration without any basis on real data. But related to this, what's our identity? Who are we? Our composition of our society is changing. Even demographers here in the US have this term, majority-minority society. If you put all the minority groups together, by 2040, there will be more than 50% of the population. So you start to have the pushback from specific groups in the population. And the same thing happens in other, in Western European countries with the increase of all these nationalist, new fascist groups, right? And Daniel Lister, he actually mentions that exactly because immigrants, they have higher levels of fertility than the native-born population in the US and Western Europe, children of immigrants, second-generation immigrants, parents born outside, but they are born in the country of destination, they will be the ones increasing their share in the population and will be the ones entering the labor market in the next decades and are going to be an important driver of the US economy. And within this process here, some discussion, I have read some articles available on the website of Population Europe. Population Europe is an organization that has a lot of studies being related to population changes, not just in Europe, but in the world as a whole. And they mentioned that in some European countries, a way to deal with the really low levels of fertility is not only rely on increase on immigration. Increase in immigration, exactly because it's people more in labor ages, they might make the society more dynamic because the society needs those people. But there are other ways too that we could try to increase the size of the labor force. And so there are discussions, for example, that still in Western European countries, the female labor force participation is still low, exactly because a lot of women who decide to have children, they don't have the support from the government, and then they don't enter the labor market as early as they could. And also because European countries usually, on average, people stay in school for a longer time by being free public schools, and then people delay entering the labor market. So there are some discussions being done about trying to make people enter the labor market in younger ages, but still invest in their education. So these are all ongoing discussions of how population aging and fertility decline kind of like shrinks the size of the labor force population in US and in Western countries, Western European countries, how we will need to deal with that. And most studies show that actually immigrants do not hurt economically the native-born population. So there is all this discourse that immigrants, they steal the jobs of low-skilled US-born people. Data don't support that, and we're going to go in details about that in the migration chapter. So if you are interested in science, that argument is not true. It's not based on scientific analysis. And because there is still a demand from the society for that. But that's a really interesting topic. A lot of studies being done on this area about how to deal with the low levels of fertility and population declining over time. What's interesting about all that is that we have changes in mortality. So people have now better health habits, lower levels of mortality. That's related to also people having fewer children, and that influences the age composition. More people living to older ages start to have higher proportions of older people, fewer children, fewer proportions of children. And migration as well, people moving to urban areas and societies that receive more immigrants, they have more people in labor ages. And all these aspects are related to family and household transition, how we organize as a family. And all these factors, they impact society. So to understand how demography impacts society, it's a really complex, it happens in really complex ways. And what's interesting here is that a lot of studies, they focus in specific point because it's so complex, all these interconnections that we usually focus, specific papers, specific dissertations, focus on specific topics. And that's an important thing. But it's also good to don't forget all these factors are influencing each other. So this is just explaining all these different transitions that are going on. There's shifts from deaths at younger ages due to communicable diseases to deaths at older ages due to degenerative diseases. Shifts from natural and high fertility to controlled and low fertility. In terms of migration, there is a growth in the number of young people in rural areas. And then this will lead to oversupply of younger people looking for jobs. And then these people will tend to leave these rural areas and looking for economic opportunities in urban areas that increases urbanization. Age transition is the changes in composition of the population, change in numbers, percentage of people in each one of the age and sex groups. Mortality decline, increase the proportion of people in older ages. Fertility decline, decreases the percentage of people in younger ages. Migration inflows increase the proportion of people in labor ages. And age transition is usually referred as master transition because it's related to all components in demography, mortality, fertility, and migration, and it forces changes in society. Urban transition is related to migration. It begins with migration from rural to urban areas, and then it changes into a more complex way, people moving from different areas. And actually, like they mentioned that there is a change into urban evolution. Now, humans overall never experienced living in rural areas. And migration start going not only to big cities, but also to suburbs and people moving to mid-sized cities that have enough resources for them. And all related to that, to all these transitions is the family and household transition. There's a diversity in composition and structure due to people living longer, lower fertility, old age structure, and urban resident. The way that we are organized as a family, as a household changes. And it's all influenced by all these other transitions in fertility, mortality, migration, age, and urban transition. Now, in this portion of the chapter, we will focus on specific theories. We'll talk first about fertility theories, and then health and mortality theories, and then internal migration and international migration theories. There are several different theories in each one to explain each one of the demographic components. For fertility, we're going to focus here on the wealth flows theory, the human ecological theory, and political economic theory. The wealth flows theory, it's more based on theories developed by the economists. So John Caldwell said that fertility patterns, how many children we have in specific societies, depends on the intergenerational flows of wealth and services. So if we have an agricultural society really based on production of agriculture, more rural, and having children is actually good because children can work for their parents on the land and help them produce more food. So you're pretty much using children as labor for that household, for that family. And then you have pretty much flows of wealth and service going from children and parents. In this case, these more rural societies based on agricultural activities is good for the parents to have large families, to have more children, because those children will provide services and then wealth that will be absorbed by the parents. But as societies start to move more into urban societies, and in urban societies it's more expensive to provide a good life standard to family, to children, good education, and so on, everything starts to be more expensive. Having more children, it's actually a burden for parents. So in that case, parents will want to have smaller families, because in this case, the parents are the ones working and try to build wealth to provide to their children, because children are not working as they were in rural areas in the past. And this changes in how the wealth goes. And when you're talking about intergenerational flows of wealth, it's exactly how wealth goes from one generation to the other. In these societies here, they were going from children helping with labor and producing wealth to parents. And here parents are producing, are working outside in urban areas and producing wealth to children. And throughout society, like as the society develops, there's an emotional nucleation of the family. So now we see the family as the parents and children. You don't have extended families all living together in the same household. So there is this emotional nucleation of the family. And that creates also an environment in which fertility tends to decline. Parents become less concerned with ancestors and extended family than with their own children and grandchildren. So the attention is given more to children and grandchildren in that smaller family group. The human ecological theory, it tries to explain changes in fertility through a macro approach. In this case here, the previous case of wealth flows theories, we are talking about a more micro approach. People deciding to have less children or more children. In the human ecological theory, we have a macro level perspective. We are not looking as much on individual decisions. We are looking at information at the aggregate level for the full society. In the work from Poston himself, the author of the textbook, and Parker Frisbee, who was a professor at UT Austin, emphasize this approach to explain changes in fertility. So the level of organization and complexity of a society is negatively related with fertility growth. So as society starts to be more complex, more specialized, you start to see a decline in fertility. High fertility makes the population vulnerable to environmental, technological, and other kinds of societal changes and fluctuations. Large quantities of sustenance are normally consumed by the familial and education institutions. So you are looking at the society as a whole being organized in a way that as we become more complex and more specialized, it's better to have lower fertility, because lower fertility enables more sustenance to be available for investment back into the system, into the educational system, and into the families themselves. All right? The political economic theory, it's, and when they mention in the textbook, is not a fertility theory per se. They're kind of like saying that's a more like a research approach in which we try to combine different perspectives. The same way that I was talking before about the theories of Malthus and Marx, that's kind of good to combine these approaches to better understand population changes over time. This political economic theory is saying we should take into account both the macro and the micro level. So we should combine the wealth flows theory, that's more micro level, and the human ecological theory, that's more macro level. And for that, we should also use different methodological approaches, more quantitative approaches, analyzing surveys, censuses, data at the aggregate level, but we should also try to collect information about specific groups, more in-depth interviews, and to better understand historical events of smaller communities. And then they give the example of this study that was done in this community, Casalecchio in Italy, in which these authors, they had access to really refined kind of data source. And they were able to implement this approach, this analysis, using a life course perspective. And looking at the individual level data that was available for them, they could see or investigate changes throughout the 19th and 20th century to investigate how the same individuals change over time and how their families kept changing over time. In this case, they had data, kind of longitudinal data that we talked before in our course, in which the same people are being followed over time and you collect data about them. And they were able to analyze historical events, to see changes in labor and marriage patterns. And they looked at both macro and micro changes in fertility. And they realized that fertility reduction depends on social class or occupational families. So they are macro structures that make people have fewer children than others, than in previous societies. And it's related to historical changes, but also to which social class I'm part of in that specific society. And these macro factors vary throughout different classes of people. So people with different individual characteristics experienced these macro changes in different ways. So they're pretty much saying, let's try to analyze the fertility changes, take into account both macro and micro factors. In terms of mortality, he starts by saying, whenever we're talking about mortality transition, mortality decline, we have to also talk about health. Because whenever you're talking about mortality, it's not just about the pattern of death. We have to also talk about health, morbidity, which is the prevalence of diseases in a specific population. So whenever we're talking about mortality, we have to take into account what are the causes of death? What are the more prevalent diseases that a specific society is experiencing? And that's related to morbidity. And the epidemiological transition theory proposed by Omran back in the 70s tries to, in the same way that the demographic transition theory tries to explain these overall changes in demographic trends, he tries to explain the overall changes in the prevalence of diseases in the population. So you have previous moments of prevailing poor health, so high morbidity and high death rates, high mortality. And in those previous societies, most people were dying at younger ages from communicable and infectious diseases. And then you have a change on the prevalence of diseases. And in more contemporary societies, these societies start to have more good health, low morbidity, so it changes from high morbidity to low morbidity, and it changes from high mortality to low mortality, lower death rates. So nowadays, most people are dying at older ages from degenerative diseases. What we experience right now during the pandemic of COVID-19, it's actually a communicable disease being affecting older age groups in higher levels. Of course, other age groups also die due to COVID-19, but you start to see that this population here, it's dying this specific moment due to the pandemic in higher levels, not only because of degenerative diseases, but to communicable diseases. This is just to show that this is complex. Overall, we move from this stage into this stage. But societies experience different changes over time, and in what we are experiencing this year and since the end of last year is exactly a moment in which these communicable diseases start to affect higher levels of older people. But again, also people in younger ages as well. And just going a little more on mortality. Mortality changes over time. So Omran, he proposed the demographic theory of mortality. What we saw before in the demographic transition theory, we were just talking about mortality decline. We didn't talk about the causes of mortality. What were the diseases that were the most prevalent among people in each one of these stages? And what here he's emphasizing is that the first stage, that's this stage of pestilence and famine. So a lot of people dying because of influenza, pneumonia, smallpox, tuberculosis, a lot of communicable and infectious diseases. Really high levels of infant mortality and childhood mortality. So mortality of children between the ages of 0 and 1 and below the age of 5 and 15 years of age. The overall life expectancy at birth really low. People used to live only on average between 20 and 40 years of age. And this first stage of age of pestilence and famine in developed countries lasted until around 1875. In the second stage, you start to see a decline in the pandemics. So mortality declines due to improvement in sanitation, standard of living, and public health. These basic measures, how the society starts to organize and provide service to the population, it increases the health outcomes, mostly exactly of infants and children as a whole. So you start to see an increase in life expectancy and people start to live on average between 30 and 50 years. And in developed countries, this second stage lasted between 1875 and 1930. The third stage, the era of degenerative and man-made diseases. So you see increases in heart diseases, cancer, stroke, more degenerative diseases. And in this moment here, mortality decline is due to medical advances in prevention and treatment of infectious diseases. And then life expectancy exceeds 70 years of age on average. So a lot of countries are in this stage here right now. And exactly because mortality is in so low levels, the fluctuations that we see in fertility are the primary factor in causing population growth, as we talked before. And the fourth stage, which is an extension of this theory, the fourth stage is proposed by Rogers and Heckenberg in 1987. They propose a more like hybristic stage, that now not only these major changes in society causes changes in the reasons of why we are dying, but individual behavior and lifestyle influence mortality. So social pathologies, accidents, alcoholism, suicide, homicide, lifestyle issues like smoking, diet, all these different factors that vary within societies and even between individuals start being more influential, because mortality is so low now that these individual behaviors cause some differences in the levels on the chances of living longer, right? And that's an interesting point, because now not only how the society as a whole is organized, because this first, second, and third stages are more based in a macro analysis. The fourth stage emphasizes more the micro analysis of mortality. Oh. And the last 2 points here in this lecture are related to theories to explain internal and international migration. Internal migration is the permanent change in residency that happens within a country, and international migration is the permanent changes in residency that happens of people moving from one country to the other. It's just good to use the correct terms. If you're doing analysis about internal migration, and if you're looking, for example, about Texas, that has been receiving more people than losing people to other areas in the US, if you're focusing the analysis of people moving from other areas in the US to Texas, you are doing an analysis of in-migration in Texas. If you're looking at California, that more recently has been exporting a lot of people to other areas in the US, you start to see that what you are doing is an analysis of out-migration from California to other places within the US. If you are trying to understand the effects of migration from Latin America to the US and how that affects the American society, you're trying to understand immigration to the US from Latin America. But what about if I'm trying to understand how losing all these people from Latin America going to the US will affect our economy, because we are losing a lot of like labor in Latin American countries. So I'm doing an analysis of what are the effects of immigration from Latin America to the US. So these terms are really important, and usually people are not really careful with them, but it's important to use it, appropriate there. And so it's almost, I think it's going to be hard to continue here, but we will continue on this topic. And it's pretty much, I give you an overview of these migration theories here based on the textbook. And then afterwards, I get some information from other additional papers to go a little bit more in detail about internal migration theories. And then international migration theories. And then in their international migration theories, I use a lot of the work by Douglas Massey, a professor at Princeton. So these are the final I think we'll be able to finish on Thursday. And the quiz 6, it's now open on Canvas, and it's going to be open until tomorrow at noon. Same style of 2 multiple choice questions. And I suggest, if you want to take your time to read again the material before you take the quiz, you have until tomorrow at noon to answer it. Okay? So thank you very much, and I see you, everybody, on Thursday. Thanks.